Hello, my name is Dave Beaudoin, the news editor here at Ballotpedia. We've covered some interesting topics in our briefing so far this year, including redistricting and the one we did last week on government responses to the coronavirus pandemic. But there's always one topic that we especially love covering here at Ballotpedia, and that's elections. Our Marquee Team is doing in-depth coverage of at least 50 elections this year, with a bunch of those being local and municipal races in cities across the country. And some of the major races that we're following include the statewide elections taking place this year in New Jersey and Virginia, and special elections taking place to fill vacancies in the U.S. House. For example, last night, Democrat Melanie Ann Stansbury won the special election in New Mexico's 1st congressional district. So here today, about 5 months into 2021, we wanted to take a look at the key primaries we're covering this year. And to help me do that is Amée LaTour, who is one of our election writers on the Marquee Team. So thanks so much for joining me today, Amée.
Hi, Dave. Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Fantastic. All right, let's jump right in. Let's start by talking about New York City's mayoral race. The primaries are on June 22nd, and the Democratic primary has more than a dozen candidates. So not only is New York the largest city by population in the country, but it's using ranked choice voting in a mayoral election for the first time. And I stayed in the New York area for a couple of days this past weekend, and I can assure you that the television commercials are fast and furious. So New York City is the largest voting jurisdiction to use ranked choice voting. Can you tell us a little bit how that process is going to work in this primary?
Yes, so voters will get to rank up to 5 candidates on their ballots. And as you mentioned, there are plenty of candidates to choose from. If nobody gets a majority of the vote on the first round of counting, the person with the fewest votes gets knocked out of the running. If the people who voted for that candidate chose someone as their second choice, their votes will be redistributed to those second choice candidates. And that process goes on until someone gets a majority.
Got it. All right. So I know we can't go into everybody who's running, but can you tell us a little bit about some of the candidates that voters will be able to choose from?
Sure, I'll mention a few. So the most well-known name nationally is Andrew Yang, who ran in the 2020 presidential race. And a lot of other candidates have backgrounds in New York politics. There's Brooklyn Borough President Eric Adams, the former City Sanitation Commissioner Catherine Garcia, City Controller Scott Stringer, Maya Wiley, who was counsel for current Mayor Bill de Blasio, and also some candidates with other types of backgrounds like Raymond McGuire, who was vice chairman of Citigroup, former Housing and Urban Development Secretary. Sean Donovan is running, and nonprofit executive Diane Morales. So a lot of people running who've held some pretty prominent positions.
Yeah, and as somebody who used to live in that area, in the New York TV market, I can tell you a lot of those names are very, very familiar, but it's amazing that all of them are running. It's probably hard to do any kind of traditional like front runner analysis in a race like this, not only because there are so many candidates, but because, as you mentioned, ranked choice voting is going to be used here as well.
Definitely, yeah. And one of the big questions is how many people will actually vote for several candidates? In one of the recent polls, 30% of respondents said that they only plan to mark their ballot for their first choice.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's an education process going on to teach people how to use ranked choice voting if they want to. I can certify that there was some commercials that I saw that were essentially teaching people how to use ranked choice voting. So I'm curious to see how many folks are going to make use of that option.
Yeah, I am too. And as far as the race goes, there are some things we can look at to get a sense for where people are at. There's just this huge caveat that as much as these things never guarantee anything, we might want to take them with some extra grains of salt in this primary. So with that said, There have been some polls that actually ran ranked choice simulations. And I want to look at a couple of the more recent ones. So this first one was done in the middle of May by Public Opinion Strategies, and it shows Yang and Adams far out in front on the first round of counting, just over 20% each. And then there's Garcia, Wiley, and Stringer with between 10 and 13%. And it took 11 rounds of tabulation to get to a point where someone got more than 50%. Garcia got eliminated after the 9th round and Wiley after the 10th round. And the final round shows Adams with 52% and Yang with 48%.
That's a great illustration. And I can tell you that the margin for error for this poll is plus or minus about 4.4 percentage points, which, remember, margin of error is in relation to each candidate, each option. So it's 4.4% on both. So you can't even say that the poll shows Adams winning, since that 4-point lead is clearly within the margin of error.
Yes, yeah, and thank you for making that point. That's an important one while we're looking at any poll result. So the second poll that I want to look at is from the beginning of last week, and this one is from Emerson College. It shows something pretty different. This time, Catherine Garcia and Adams leading with just over 20% on the first round, and Yang in third with about 16%. And this poll shows Yang getting eliminated after the 10th round and Garcia ultimately with 55% to Adams's 45%. And that's beyond the margin of error. And this just kind of goes to demonstrate how much results can change from poll to poll.
Yeah, definitely. I did see some media outlets saying that Garcia got a boost from an endorsement in the New York Times that came the middle of May 10th. But whether or not these variations in results are a result in the race changing or just how the polls were done, we really can't say for sure. Ranked choice voting is a new territory for a lot of pollsters, and it's going to be interesting. We're going to need some time to build up some history to kind of see how this all works and how different pollsters are at coming up with good representations of what we think the race is going to be using ranked choice voting. Let's talk about some of the issues that are being discussed in this New York City primary. I imagine there's a mix of your typical large city issues. There's also the 2021 specific issue of pandemic recovery, as well as some issues that are probably unique to New York. So what are the candidates really talking about?
Well, definitely economic recovery from the pandemic, as you said. And a few other big issues are affordable housing, policing, and public safety. These are what candidates are highlighting and also what voters are identifying in opinion polls as their priorities.
Well, with this many candidates, I'm sure it would be impossible to summarize everybody's stances, even if we had this webinar run for much longer than it's going to. And we have some other elections that we want to talk about. But can you give us just a sampling, Amée, of the kinds of proposals that these candidates in New York City are talking about?
Sure. So Yang, he was known in the presidential race for his universal basic income idea, and he does have a narrower version of a basic income proposal in this primary, but he's emphasizing small business recovery more. And Catherine Garcia wants to make some changes around the permitting process for small businesses and start a zero interest microloan program. Maya Wiley has a 5-year, $10 billion spending plan on public works projects that she calls New Deal New York. Eric Adams is really highlighting public safety in his campaign. He says he experienced police brutality and racism as a teenager, and that he went on to become a police officer to combat racial injustice inside the department. Scott Stringer is making affordable housing a big issue in his campaign. He wants to require any new buildings with more than 10 apartments to make a quarter of them affordable to low and middle income families. So just to name a few of the major proposals going around.
Great, thanks for the rundown, Amée. So we have a lot more information on our site about the candidate's key messages. I'm going to try to drop a link in the chat so everybody can find that. But if you can't, it's on our page about mayoral election in New York, New York. You can also find a list of endorsements on that page. And I also think that we are going to be waiting a while to find out who wins this primary. And that has something to do with the way the city is running their absentee ballot process, right, Amée?
Yeah, so the city will count absentee ballots received by June 29th, as long as they're postmarked, I believe, by election day. And then voters will have until July 9th to resolve any errors on their ballots that the Board of Elections may have found. So it could be several weeks before we have final results from that primary.
All right, the New York City mayoral race coming up later this month. It's going to be very, very fascinating. All right, let's pivot now to our marquee statewide races. Let's start with Virginia. Governor Ralph Northam could not seek re-election because of term limits. In Virginia, governors can only serve one consecutive term, just one term at a time. They can run again, but they have to take at least one cycle or one term off. So Amée, can you tell us a little bit about who's running in the Democratic primary that's coming up a week from yesterday, that's June 8th?
Sure. So there are 5 candidates in that primary, all current or former office holders. One of them is former Governor Terry McAuliffe. He served one term from 2014 to 2018. We have Lieutenant Governor Justin Fairfax, Jennifer Carroll Foy, who served 2 years in the House of Delegates until last year, Lee Carter, who's a current state delegate, and Jennifer McClellan, who's been in the state legislature since 2006.
All right, so those are all pretty prominent office holders. Which of those candidates seem to have gained the most traction so far in this primary?
Well, a couple polls from April show McAuliffe with a pretty big lead. He was polling over 40% and nobody else got 10%. But it's worth noting that the second highest polling answer in those surveys was undecided.
Yes, undecided. And of course, McAuliffe is prominent not only as former governor, but also former chairman of the Democratic National Committee. And that poll that you mentioned was, I guess, over a month ago. So another thing that we tend to look at sometimes is noteworthy endorsements. So Amée, can you tell us a little bit more about what you're seeing in this Virginia Democratic primary?
Sure, there are a lot of endorsements, but to name a few, McAuliffe, excuse me, McAuliffe and McClellan have most of the endorsements from state legislators. Democratic leaders in the state House and Senate endorsed McAuliffe. Northam, the current governor, also endorsed McAuliffe, and so did Hillary Clinton and Nancy Pelosi. McClellan was endorsed by Mayoral Pro-Choice Virginia. Carol Foy has some endorsements from the Working Families Party and Emily's List. And another group of endorsers that I want to mention in this primary are those that support women of color. Both Carol Foy and McClellan are Black women, and the group Higher Heights for America endorsed Carol Foy. The Women of Color Coalition endorsed McClellan. And McAuliffe has emphasized that he got more endorsements from members of the state legislative Black caucus than any other candidate in this primary, and that includes an endorsement from the Senate President Pro Tem Louise Lucas. Jennifer McClellan is the vice chair of the legislative Black caucus.
All right, thanks, Amée. That's a great breakdown of all that's going on with the endorsements in the Virginia governor's race. And it will be very interesting to see how that will shake out. And we're talking about something that's only a week away for us to hopefully know what's going on. We should also note that there will not be a Republican primary alongside the Democratic primary next week, since the state Republican Party decided to hold a convention instead.
Yes. And Dave, I did see that you did some coverage of that in The Brew, which is the daily newsletter that you send out. So I'm going to flip things around for a minute, if that's all right. and ask you to tell us more about that convention.
Okay, sure. So Republicans held their convention on May 8th. They selected Glenn Youngkin as their gubernatorial nominee, as well as nominees for both lieutenant governor and attorney general, which are the three statewide offices up for election this year in Virginia. It was a unique convention in a lot of ways. It was an unassembled convention, meaning that delegates met in 39 different locations across the state. And that was a precaution that was implemented because of the coronavirus pandemic. And they also used ranked choice voting to select their candidates, which is an interesting theme that we've had so far today in the briefing. The state party had never done that before, and obviously we're seeing, some more and more jurisdictions use that. There were 53,000 Republicans in Virginia that registered to be delegates at the convention, and I think somewhere around 30-some thousand actually participated. So that's a lot.
Yeah, thank you. That was definitely a noteworthy election.
All right, and as I mentioned, Virginia is holding elections for the lieutenant governor, which is elected separately, also their attorney general this year, in addition to elections for the House of Delegates, which is their lower chamber in the state legislature. All right, we've covered a lot about Virginia. Now let's pivot to New Jersey, and that is the other state that is holding their gubernatorial election in 2021. So Democratic Governor Phil Murphy is running for re-election. And aside from a write-in candidate, he is not facing any challengers in the primary. So the Republican primary is the same day as Virginia's Democratic primary for governor. So there's going to be a lot happening June 8th. That's a week from yesterday. So tell us a little bit about the Republican candidates in New Jersey.
Sure. So 4 Republicans are running, and 2 of them ran in the 2017 Republican primary for governor. That's Jack Ciattarelli, who came in second that year, and Hirsch Singh, who came in third. And these are also the only 2 candidates who qualified for the one primary debate that was held this year. Ciattarelli was a member of the State General Assembly from 2011 to 2018. Singh is an engineer at his family's business that specializes in things like missile defense and aviation security.
All right. And as a former resident of the state of New Jersey, I can tell you both of those names are pretty well known based on the previous run in 2017. I know there hasn't been much polling in this primary. There was actually a poll commissioned by the Democratic Governors Association that came out last week that showed Ciattarelli with 29% and Singh with 23%. And of course, that still leaves quite a few votes up for grabs. Any major points of conflict between these candidates? I know there was a primary debate that they had that was pretty heated either last week or the week before.
Yes. So in that primary debate, they criticized each other's backgrounds quite a bit. Singh called Ciattarelli a career politician, referring to the years he spent in local office, as well as, he was in the General Assembly. Ciattarelli mentioned that Singh lost several elections, primaries for Senate and House, as well as the 2017 primary that they both lost. They talked about Trump during the debate too. Ciattarelli saying that Biden won the 2020 presidential election, and Singh disagreeing and saying that Trump won.
Interesting. And I saw Singh called Ciattarelli a Liz Cheney, Mitt Romney Republican. So it's interesting the kind of things their candidates are saying about each other. And obviously, these are holdovers from the national party tensions that are happening in some areas of the Republican Party, and they're present here. New Jersey is also holding elections for lieutenant governor and both chambers of the state legislature. So again, a lot to follow in New Jersey as well in 2021. All right, so we've talked about New York City and Virginia and New Jersey, and now, Amée, I want to talk to you if there are any other particularly interesting primary elections that you yourself are excited about covering this year.
Oh, yes. I'm really looking forward to covering Seattle's elections. I got to cover the Seattle City Council races in 2019, and this year there are elections for mayor and 2 at-large city council seats. Seattle's a really interesting city in that it's very democratic and there's a lot of ideological conflict between people who are maybe closer to the center and those further left on some issues. In 2019, the races were largely defined by tension between some candidates who were endorsed by a political action committee that got most of its funding from Amazon, which is headquartered in the city, and other candidates backed by a progressive group that said it formed to counter the influence of corporations in local elections. So it'll be interesting to see if those same factions are as active this year.
Right, it's a great summary. And of course, the things that they're talking about in Seattle, some of them are similar to what we're seeing in other large city elections, and others are unique to Seattle, just like other issues were unique to New York City. Those are things like taxes on businesses, affordable housing, and what to do about homelessness in Seattle that has emerged as an issue in recent years. And also Mayor Jenny Durkan is not seeking re-election, so that race is open, right?
Yes, and the current city council president and a former city council president who also served as interim mayor in 2017 are both running in that primary, as are lots of other candidates too. One of the city council members is running for re-election, and the other council race is open. Those primaries are August 3rd, so we'll be diving into those races more in the next couple of months.
Yes, that'll be something exciting over the summer. And just to remind people, Seattle does not have partisan primaries. Everyone runs in nonpartisan primaries, and the top two finishers advance to the general election. So every jurisdiction, especially as it relates to local elections, some of them do things just a little bit differently. So it's always good to check with the content that we have to let you know how the election is going to be decided and basically what the rules are in the primary and in the general election. All right, well, we're not going to get to all of the reader and viewer submitted questions that we've had today, but I did want to ask you, Amée, a couple of the ones that we've received. This first question is about ideological differences among the candidates for mayor in New York City. Are the leading candidates progressive or moderate, or is there a mixture of both?
That is a good question. So the New York Times did interviews with several of the Democratic primary candidates. And in their summary of those interviews, the Times said that Dianne Morales, Scott Stringer, and Maya Wiley are on the more progressive end of the spectrum. And Catherine Garcia, Andrew Yang, Eric Adams, and Raymond McGuire tended more toward the center. Specifically on the issues of policing and economic development. So if we look at polls, three of the candidates who've been somewhat consistently at the top recently, Adams, Garcia, and Yang, are three that the Times says are more centrist among the Democratic candidates. Maya Wiley has been polling third or fourth, two who they identified as being more progressive. I do think it's worth noting also that in a couple polls that we saw in April, Stringer had been polling toward the top with Yang and Adams.
That's a great breakdown. And it is probably worth noting that there's been some recent major news developments or some recent news developments affecting some of these candidates. A former campaign aide has accused Stringer of sexual misconduct. That news broke in April. And also Garcia was endorsed by the New York Times, as we mentioned before. So, and also you have a mix of the candidates and what their backgrounds are, the ones that have been really high in polling. So Garcia has a background in city government. Adams' background is in city and state government and on the police force. And then Yang has also been prominent in business and in some nonprofit endeavors.
Yeah, and that's something that the New York Times emphasized as, in some cases, the more significant difference between candidates being their backgrounds and their experience.
Well, we can't stop talking about the New York City mayoral race. That's how fascinating it is from folks that are really interested in watching how this all plays out. So we'll stop talking about that. We also have this other question here that I want to ask you about ranked choice voting, which I said has been a consistent theme throughout this briefing. Are there any other big elections that are happening this year using ranked choice voting?
Yes, there are. So New York City has some other elections this year for controller and also for city council. Some other places that'll use ranked choice voting this year are St. Paul and Minneapolis, Minnesota. Those local races don't have primaries. The generals are in November. And we'll certainly be following those mayoral races. Minneapolis is where George Floyd was killed just over a year ago. And the former officer responsible was recently convicted of murder. And I was looking at our coverage of the 2017 mayoral race, and I saw the top issues in that race were policing and public safety in response to police shootings. So we'll certainly be hearing more about those issues this year in those local elections. I know there's been some conflict between the current mayor of Minneapolis and the city council around these issues, and the incumbent mayor is planning to run again, and several city council seats are up for election as well.
Yes, that's going to be fascinating. I mean, I was heavily involved in our coverage of the Minneapolis mayoral race back in 2017, and I can assure you that police issues were a definite focus then as well. So that will be fascinating to watch. So we are pretty much out of time, but Amée, thank you so much for walking all through this all today. This has been great stuff.
Thanks for having me, and thanks everyone for tuning in.
All right, I hope you enjoyed this look at this year's top primaries. I know this helped me whet my appetite for some interesting election news that's going to be coming in the weeks and months ahead. And as we mentioned, that all kind of kicks off next week with the primaries in New Jersey and Virginia. And if you like this breakdown, you're going to want to stay on top of all of our coverage of politics, election, and government here at Ballotpedia. But first, I want to remind everyone that at Ballotpedia, we rely on donations for all that we do. So if you like our work and you want to support us, please consider donating by going to www.ballotpedia.org/donate, and you can see how to contribute and make our coverage possible. So to stay connected with us, you want to do one of two things, or both. One is to regularly visit our homepage at ballotpedia.org, as I mentioned, where we feature the latest political news along with links to all of our major coverage areas and all of our analyses. And then the other way to stay informed is through our newsletters, which Amée mentioned earlier. They cover a wide variety of topics, from election policy to the federal courts to the administrative state and everything else in between. If you've never subscribed to our newsletters, I'm going to recommend these two, but like I said, there's a bunch to pick from. One is our flagship daily political news summary called the Daily Brew, and the other is our weekly news recap. We do one for both federal and also state and local stories, and those come out on Saturdays, and that's called The Tap. So if you click on the link on our homepage regarding newsletters, you can review samples, and you can subscribe to whichever ones you like. Thank you very much for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.